Hello, hi everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the European New World literature in Africa. Hopefully you're enjoying this course so far and also the videos that we prepared for you that have to do with the various forms of literature in classical and historical times. Literatures in European and European derived languages in Africa. Afrikaans. Afrikaans literature in South Africa can be viewed in the context of Dutch literary traditions or South African literary traditions. Within an African continent, Afrikaans literature will be forever on the outside, as is the case with language. It is caught in an identity crisis that was created irrevocably by the fiery defended political and cultural identity of the Dutch settlers who arrived in South Africa in 1652 and whose descendants, together with the English-speaking whites, took over the government in 1948, after which the notorious system of apartheid was enshrined in laws that would be demolished only in the early 1900s. The conservative branch of the African people, always the most numerous and most powerful, was in conflict throughout the 20th century with the talented and growing group of young poets and novelists such as C. Louis Lepoid and Brighton Beyterbach, who brought to broaden the confines of the increasingly limited people and literature. The history of the Africans' literature is a history of the Africans, an alien people whose literature is a testimony of the state of alienation. This is from African literature, literatures in European and European derived languages from the Britannica.com. Afrikaans with the root in Dutch has been spoken in South Africa mainly by whites since 18th century. The first African language movement began in 1875, led by Stephanus Jacobus du Toit and others, to represent an effort to make the Afrikaans a language separate from Dutch. The first newspaper in Afrikaans, Die Patriot, the Patriot, began publication in 1876. The linguistic shift from Dutch to Afrikaans did not occur without considerable dispute among the whites of Dutch descent. It was after the South African War, 1899 to 1902, which became a prominent subject of early Afrikaans literature, that Afrikaans became a significant written language. Winternag, 1905, Winter's Night, a poem by Eugene Marius and Die Volte, 1906, The Plain. A poem by Jan Sellers dramatically ushered into the new literary language, along with the language organizations as Suit Afrikies, Andermine, founded in 1909, Die Bandwagon, The Outpost, a magazine, had literary section of 1910. The Herzog Prize for Poetry, Prose, and Drama in Afrikaans was established in 1914. Publishing houses specializing in Afrikaans publication began in 1914 and 1915. In 1914, colonist Jacob Langhoven fostered Afrikaans in schools, and the language was soon studied at universities and used as a medium of instruction. Parliament recognized Afrikaans as official language in 1925, 6 years after it was named the language of the Dutch Reformed Church. Earlier in 19th century, writing had been heavily dialectic. By the 1920s, this had begun to change. Poets became the first prominent Tarangaburgers of the new language of the second Afrikaans language movement began. They included Lepoid, Marius Sellers, Jacob Daniel du Toit, Tolius, Daniel Frankels, Malibri, and Toon van den Heer. Lepweit, who one day be condemned as a traitor to Afrikaners, was probably one of the greatest and most original poets of the early 20th century. While Marnus, in his poetry, linked European tradition to the realities of life in South Africa, prose also appeared during this period, moving away from such melodramatic works as Johannes van Werk in 1906, a novel by J. H. and H. de Waal, to more rigorously realistic historical works such as those by Gustav Preller. Realism began to dominate Afrikaans prose, especially in the work of Johan van Bergen, who wrote a trilogy, the first part of which, Ampi die Nature Kind, 1931, Ampi, the Child of Nature, a study of poor white in South Africa. A. Pienaar, Sudium Sangrio wrote popular books about animals. Drama also began to flourish through the writings of Lepweit, Langhoven, and H.A. Fanon. Langhoven was also a popular poet as A.J. Visser. Dramatic events in 1930, including a drought that caused many farmers to move to cities, significant political changes, a sharpening of radical conflict, and deepening of African-English conflict, isolated Afrikaners more dramatically in South Africa, and fiercely partisan organizations like African Broodbond and Federatie van Afrikaners Volterani gained new adherents. The Afrikaner poets known as Detchers, 30ers, and writers of the 1930s infuriated conservative Afrikaners with new type of poetry. The poetry of W.E.G., Lou N.P. van Wyk and Elizabeth Habers was at the heart of the fertile activity, which centered on experimentation with form. Van Wyk Lo Radka, 1941, is rhymed study of evil. Radka is an incarnation of the evil taking over the community. There was a prose written during this period by Abraham H. Klonker and C.M. van den Heer and Johannes van Melly, and whose Bart Nell 1936, dealing with African rebellion in 1914-15, is considered by some to be the finest novel in Afrikaans. After World War II, literary magazines carried Afrikaans work. D.J. Opperman continued the experimentation with Afrikaans language in his poetry, and he introduced diversively South African racial themes in his work. In 1954, Arthur Fulla became one of the first Black Africans to write a novel in Afrikaans. Audrey Blanchard and Elise Muller wrote short stories and essays, and Anna M. Lowe wrote novels. Continued. The Sesters, also known as Sixters, or writers of the 1960s, attempted to do for prose what Deningers had done for poetry. Jan Raby, N.T. Larox, Dol van Nurk, Andre P. Brink, Abraham D. Varys, and Chris Bernard experimented with the novel and moved to areas largely forbidden until that time, such as the sex and the atheism. Brink Loba, Viri Dailar, 1962, Pledge for Life, and The Orgy in 1965, and The Orgy caused sensations. Bartholomew Smith wrote Mother Hannah in 1959, The Mother Hannah, an acclaimed drama about the South African War. He also wrote Put Sounder Water, 1962, Well Without Water, considered among the finest plays produced in Afrikaans. It would not be performed because of the political message. Elsa Jort wrote a novel about a Black woman, Dyer Swearwer Van Papi Nagina, 1978, The Long Journey of Papi Nagina and Pape. Carol Schumann in Elderland, 1984, Another Country, moved into the sensitive political and social realities of South Africa. Adam Small wrote works such as Kana H. Cole, 40, Kana, He is Coming Home, and revealed the realities in the lives of the non-whites in South Africa. Ingrid Honker wrote intensely personal poetry. Vanderbilt wrote serial poetry, and his work revealing the struggle with Africans' political situation in the South Africa His Coffee's 1964 Catastrophes is a series of sketches that take racism, death, and madness as their subjects. These themes persisted through the end of the 20th century. Rania Sheepers and the Die Ding during the Die 1990, The Thing of the Fire, a collection of short stories blended Zulu oral tradition with the world of the Apiathar. Marlene Van Nurk wrote Tronoff, 1994. The Triumph, English translation, Tronoff, a novel based in Sophiatown, a black settlement near Johannesburg, was replaced by the South African government in the 1950s and 60s by the white working class suburb Judith and Letty Lowen's Ver Coast, 1964, Laminated Coast. A husband leaves his family to join a fight against apartheid. In his novels, Turbine, 1986, Astral Voices, and Joe, 1996, Peru and Tamine Van Herden dealt with the 20th century African American history. See also the literature Africans and South African literature. English. Early works in English in the Western Africa include Liberian novel Love in Ebony, a West African romance published in 1932 by Charles Cooper, pseudonym Vari Carly, as well as such works as Ghanaian folk literature as J. Bonnie Burger, Blaise Amelia Promise and Fulfillment, 1944. R.E. Oberg, a Ghanaian, wrote 18 Pence, 1941, in the early work in the conflict between African and European cultures. Other nearly popular writers in Ghana include Azir Ponderu, F.U. Sutherland, and Wezi Brew. The Nigerian Omos Tuluna wrote the Palm Wine Dinkard and the Dead Palm Wine Trappard in Deadstown, 1952, its construction revealing a clear linkage between the oral and literary traditions. And the hero moves to the dead towns to bring a tapster back to the land of the living. The elixir the hero brings back from the land of the dead. However, it's an egg that is death dealing as surely as with life giving. Kulia is faithful in oral tradition, but he places traditional journey tale into the very contemporary framework. Nigeria has been the front of creative writing in English from the works of Chinia, overtures of Ben Orki and Wool Soyika, winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986, as well as drama, poetry, and prose. His interpreters, 1965, weave stories from contemporary world of the mythic and historical past, manipulating a time and end with very structure of the story is the commitment on the lives of several protagonists. Sonika was a contributor to and co-editor of the influential journal of Black Sophists, founded in 1957 and containing the early works of poets such as Christopher Ogbo of Nigeria, Dennis Brutus, and Alex Lagama of South Africa, and Tichia Yu Tommys of Congo, Brazzaville. Another literary journal, The Horn, launched in 1958 by John Pepper Clark, provided traditional opportunities for writers to have their works published. Transition, a literary journal, began in Uganda in 1960 by Rajet Noji, was also a valuable outlet for many African writers. Abi's Things Fall Apart, 1958, is perhaps the best known African novel of the 20th century. Its main character is Onakowo, whose tragic and fatal flaw, his overweening ambition, wounds him. His frenzied desire to be anything but what his father was causes him to develop a warped view of the society, so that in the end, that view becomes, thanks to 7 humiliating years in exile reality to him. When he returns, he cannot accept seeing his people in the throes of adapting to the intruding whites, and things fall apart for him. It is not society he envisioned, and he takes his life. Things fall apart in a pre-colonial novel that ends with the coming of colonialism, which triggers Okawo's demise. Okawo is in any case doomed because of his screwed vision. Flora Niwa wrote the novel E for You in 1966, the story of a talented, brilliant, and wonderful, beautiful woman who's living in a small community is confronted by tradition. Continued. A woman's fundamental role, childbearing, is prescribed for her, and she does not fulfill that role. She suffers from negative criticism of members of society, borrowing a technique from oral tradition. Nwaba injects the dimension of fantasy through the character of the goddess Yumari, who is a mythic counterpart of the real life E for You. In The Slave Girl, 1977, the novelist Abrichi Emecha tells the story of Ojibata, who, as she journeys from childhood to adulthood, moves not to freedom and independence, but from one form of slavery to another. Okibi blends fantasy and reality in his novel, The Famished Road, 1991, part of the trilogy that includes Songs of Enchantment, 1933, and Infinite Riches, 1998. In the novel, which addresses the reality of post-colonial Nigeria, Oki uses myth, the Yuba, Obi is the spirit child, and other fantasy images to shift between pre-independence and post-independence setting. The spiritual and the real world are linked in the novel, the one of the dimensions of the other, and in the narrative mode the African storytellers have been using for centuries. In the other parts of Western Africa, Lynn Peters of Gombe and Phil Tiny Crocker of Sierra Leone are among the most important 20th century writers. The novelist Ibayu Diba and the poet Tidjan M. Salah were also part of it in the Gambia. Cameroonian authors writing in English during the second half of the 20th century include Bibala Muta, John S. Dinjka, Jedea Ajuri. Writers in Ghana during the same period include Ama Darko, B. Kojo Lang, Keofi Owufanar, and Ire Kawiyamar. In Fragments, 1970, Amar tells of a youth, Babako, who returns from the United States to his Ghanaian family and is torn between the new demands of his home and the consequent subversion of the traditional past, representing a mythical Nana, his blind grandmother, who established a context for the tragic story of Bago who's expecting. It's interesting that the story is about somebody named Nana. I actually know a lady and they call her Nana. And she just died, but she was almost 103. She died a month short of her 103rd birthday in California. Continuing, the dominant writer to emerge from East Africa is Kenyan Nurjewa Thongo, and A Grain of Wheat, 1967, tells the story of Mangu, alone and alienated farming, having played a role in Mawu rebellion. Though he has considered himself the Moses of his people, he has a terrible secret. As Mugo's story unfolds, the novelist works into a narrative of other stories, including those of Gingio, Mombi, and Kajarja, each of whom has a unsavory past as well. Niger constructs the story around the proverb Kalinko Ki Nugi Miwako, which that means bite you is your own clothing. Later in his career, Njiko spent many years in exile from Kenya, engaging many writers in debate as whether African writers should compose their own works in European and African languages. Other East African novelists include Okio Okoli Grace Ogard, Peter K. Palingoyo, and W.E. Malifia. And Timothy Wang Yusa novel Upon This Mountain, 1989. The character Niwambu climbs the mountain and comes of age. And two novels from Uganda, A Boy Moves to Manhood, Abzian Chronicles 2000 by Moses Eshawa and the Seven of the Thomas Thibault, 1986, and John Nejinda, a later and allegorical novel in which the boy's loss is innocence is tied to politics in that country. One of Africa's greatest novelists is Somali writer Nurian Farah, who wrote a trilogy composed of the novels and the maps 1986, Gives 1992, Secrets 1998. Maps is the story of the youth Azakar growing up in Somalia, divided by Ethiopia, with the mythic Mizra, who becomes his surrogate mother, and by means of the geographical movement that occurs within a rich mixture of politics and sex. The boy seeks his identity, a quest that becomes linked to the identity of the land across which he moves. From Mali, which such writers as Jack Mapahi, whose collection of the poems Skipping Without Ropes, 1998, reflects his 4 years of a political prisoner, and David Rabadi. Other writers from South Africa include V. Wang Yanja, M. Mulitika, and Dominique Molichio from Zambia, and Brighane Mariam Sali, Cecily, and Danica Chu Workshu, and Tia Gabi Menhen from Ethiopia, Solomon M. Machawario, Dam Buzo, Mariho, Shamir, Chindoya, Chinkiria Hov, Yvonne Vera, Alexander, Kayanjo, J, Zeppo, Maureen, Bazi, Pardawa are all among Zimbabwe's writers in English. Tisea Deng Goringaba wrote Nervous Conditions, 1988, a story of two Shona girls, Tambazia and Naisha, both attempting to find their place in contemporary Zimbabwe. Naisha has been abroad and wonders about the effect of the westernization has had on her and her family, while Tanzimbio is longing to break out of her traditional world. Looming in the background are mythical figures, including Lucia, Tamazia's aunt. Doris Lessing is a British writer who spent her early years in what is today Zimbabwe. Her novel, The Grass is Singing, 1950, centers on Dick Turner and Mary Turner, a white couple attempting to become a part of the rural African landscape. Lessing depicts a stereotype African character, Moses, a black servant whose name gives him historical and religious renaissance. He becomes dominant over European Mary, manipulating her fears and love of him until the end destroys her. Lessing finds mythic fantasy dimensions in European, much as Mustafa Said does in The Women of England and Al Tabit Salih's novel Season of Migration of the North, 1966. There's so much writing in English by experts that is rooted in South Africa, from poetry of Thomas Pringle, from E.A. Kendall's The English Boy at the Cape, 1835, the novels of H. Rider Haggard and John Buchan, and Turning Wheels, 1937, by Stuart Colote. Olive Schreiner was the first major South African-born writer. Her novel, The Story of an African Farm, 1883, continues to have her international renaissance. And Pauline Smith wrote powerful short stories. Her novel, The Beetle, 1926, deals largely with experiences of Afrikaners and Eastern Cape region. Sarah Gertrude Millen had an international audience, such as the works of God's Stepchildren, 1924. The short-lived literary review of Borslang Whiplash began in 1926, published for wider audiences. Works such as poets of John Campbell, William Palmer, and Lawrence van der Post. A common subject in the works of many South African authors and writings in English during the 20th century is racial segregation. Codified as apartheid in the 1948 that dominated the country until early 1990s. The two earlier novels, Mine Boy, 1946, by Peter Abrahams, and The Cry, The Beloved Country, 1946, by Alan Petram, Black Africans go to Johannesburg and experience the terror of apartheid. Into Every Birth is Blood, 1981, Mongo Wally Shorty tells stories of his T. Molub and Obia Malte. Thai looks to his past and wonders, where does the river begin and take journey to the sea? The world in which Upia, the son of Mary, Thai's sister, lives postdates in the Soweti uprising of 1976, a time when Renaissance to apartheid took hold of the new generation and South African witnessed attacks and bombings. Because of their experiences with the police, Moby's family became more publicized. Threat wants the reader to see the human side of characteristics, their vulnerabilities, their uncertainties, while he also wants to demonstrate that it's not an easy matter to make the revolutionary leap. A Ride in the Whirlwind, 1981, by Sydney Sapala, which sets in Soweto, experienced the fearful effects of apartheid. The playwright Athoid Fungold in 1982 produced the play Master Harold and the Boys and the story of the white boy Haley in a restaurant which makes two African men, Willie and Malapo and Sam Shamila, are waiters. The story of a boy's coming of age with the realities of the racist system in South Africa. As the story develops, Haley transfers his fear, love, and hate of his father to Sam, and at the end, he treats Sam as he cannot treat his father. The result is open a view of the wounds of apartheid. The novel Julie's People, 1981, by Nadine Gordimer, who received a Nobel Prize in Leadership in 1991, takes place in imagined post-independence South African. The story deals with Smallies, a white couple whose relationship with July and their black servant. By means of flashbacks, the Smallies are reconstructed their past in the world of Johannesburg suburb during the apartheid period. There's a war, and Maureen Smalley and her Bamford Smalley escape from their suburban home and go north, where the erstwhile liberals come to July's royal home and learn by their interactions with July and the family and friends, and they cannot move past their former relationship with their servant and cannot see him from any perspective but that of the liberal, self-confident white overlords. That hopelessly compromised position with the impasse of the Gordimer investigates this novel. D.M. Zoni is the pseudonym's author for Robben Island in 1973, a novel dealing with political prison maintained by South African government off the shores of Cape Cod in the mid-1960s. It's a story of Beckman, an African political leader jailed at Robben Island, and it relates to his dreams and fantasies, his despair and his anger, his torture and his death. J.M. Kazi, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1903, wrote Life and Times, Michael K. 1983, a story and a blurred hero and distinct historical and geographical background. It describes a war that could be any war, a country that could be a country, a bureaucracy that could be any bureaucracy. Although it all, Michael K., a frail, nondescript, mute man of his 30s, born with a cleft lip, survives, not betraying his past, where he has no past, tied as he is the unbroken community of history. So does Kotsi link apartheid to the ages. The novel becomes in the end an affirmation of humanity. The earth is destroyed, a man is incarcerated, but he's willing to return, crawling out of the dust of the ruin and recreating the earth, making it grow and fiercely. Maru, 1971, a novel by Bezzy Head, tells a story of liberation of San people from ethnic to racial opposition and about the liberation of the Tanzania people of Dili and their prejudice and hatred. It's a story of flawed world and attempts of the two mythical people, Maru and Margaret Kenmore. To restore it has a former perfection. It also is a love of the story. Margaret, the Los Mazariwa, opens the hearts of the Mawiya and as well as political story. Margaret Canamore to restore it in the form of perfection. It's also a love story. Margaret the Lothian Mazarwa opens her heart to Molia and Daglidi, as well as a political story. Margaret animates Maru's political version with the love and the art, and in the end, Maru is a realistic story with the mythical vision and the love and the art. In the end, Maru is a realistic story with a mythical overlay in which oral and literary traditions are brought together. French. In the work of the earliest African writers in French can be found the themes that run through the literature to the present day. These themes have to do with African tradition, with French colonialism and displacement of African both physically and spiritually from their native tradition, with attempts to blend the French and the African traditions with the post-independence efforts to piece the shreds of African tradition and French colonial experience into new reality. In the novel Tres Relatives de Malik in 1920, The Three Wishes of Malik, the Sunnis writer Amadou Madigani anticipates such later writers as Lashi Ahmed Gain, also of Sigo. In Durain's novel Malik, a wolf boy is embroiled in the struggle between a Muslim tradition and influence of the West. He goes to a French-run school to study. Then instead of going to Quranic school as his parents wish, he becomes a blacksmith. Other early African works in French frequently deal with the tensions between country and city, between African and French culture, and between traditional religious practices and Islam. The novel Fausse Bonté, 1926, Much Goodwill by Bansky Delonio of Seagulls, deals with youth caught in conflict between a Muslim background and Western values and culture. The Beninese writer Paul Hazomi wrote Dogamini, 1938, English translation Dogamini, a historical novel depicting the time and the region of King Zhou of the ancient kingdom of Dami. Some writers focus solely on African tradition with positive and negative qualities. These writers include Felix Condrot, whose novel Il est Slave, 1926, The Slave, examines slavery and traditional Gami. Their son is writer Sami Slos wrote in Karim, 1935, a novel that depicts a young wolf caught between traditional and Western values. He leaves the countryside for French cities of St. Louis and Dakar, but loses everything when he falls prey in the city's wilds. He returns in the end to a traditional way of living. The novel depicts new society that's being born in the early 20th century Africa. Marriages de Paris, 1930. Marriages of Paris has to do with the Segal students in Paris who fall in love with a French woman. Abdul Sadeh of Single wrote Manamimona in 1958. English transition, Mamaminona, it's the same thing, about the African girl who leaves home and goes to Dakar, where she is seduced. She returns home and bears a child who dies. She becomes ill but recovers her traditional roots. Women's place in Cameroonian society are the subject to Joseph or Sante Bella, 1959, and Bella. The first novel to be published in Cameroon. Paul Lamy Deshiba of Congo, Brazzaville, wrote Nego de Crocodile, 1948, Nago de Crocodile, translated in Magado, a story rooted in African tradition. Fargalocato, Roman du un petit village Africani, 1958, Fargalocato, novel of a little African village by Emily Herzine, an early Guinean novel that examines African tradition and Western technology. Jean Magado, born in Congo, Brazzaville, wrote Diarani, 1954, Heart of Arani, an anti-colonial novel. Traditional African society is primary concern of the novel's Les Flèches du Fletcher, 1955, The Son of Charm by David Amru Tongo and Crepuscule des Temps Arises, 1962, Dwight of Ancient Days by Naz Boni of Upper Vlota, later Bosca Vasco. Madagascar, the Journal of La Vete de Mascar, founded in 1933, encouraged writing by Malagasy writers and included poetry and Jean Joseph. Rabazoso, who Le Caput de Sandras, 1924, Cutting the Ashes, and Slavas, 1927, Forest, were collected of poems that sought to blend French and Malagasy cultural traditions and shared many of the themes later taken by the Negro movement. Other early poets writing in French in the Madagascar include Elie, Charles, Abraham E. Randamarca, and Paul Rasfumarzo. Edouard Barzo produced one of the first Malagasy novels, La Seymour Incarnée, 1932, The Unknown Sister, a historical novel about the conflict between French and Marina Cova state in Madagascar at the turn of the 20th century. Michael Francis Robinry found the newspaper Éclair de la Mer and wrote a poetry collected in Les Fleurs de Fuentes, 1927, Dead Flowers. After World War II, many Africans who served in the French army remained in France, bringing pressure to the country to end colonialism and political assimilation. They went with blacks from the United States. The result was a new concern with and pride of the African cultural identity. This acknowledgement of blackness, of black roots, black history, black civilization became part of the struggle against colonialism and involved under the tutelage of Leopard Senghor of Segal, Amy Zechery of Martinique, and Leon Contrand Damas of French Guiana, into a movement that became known as Nurturgut, Cesare Canhe Dion Retour a Place Natal, 1939, Notebook of the Return of the Native Land, or Return to My Native Land, and Seymour's Anthology de la Nouvelle Passé Negre et Marche de Negre, French, 1948, Anthology of the New Black and Maze poetry of the French language are among the important works of this movement, as Dior's own poetry, including Chants d'Ombre, 1949, Songs of the Shade, and Ethiopics, 1956. The struggle had earlier been waged against the short-lived journals as Legitimate Defense, 1932, Legitimate Defense, and El Leonor, 1935, The Black Student. In 1947, the Journal Presence of Africani, African Presence, was inaugurated. It would play a significant role in the encouragement and development of the Francophone writing. Berigo Diop of Segal wrote poetry, Larze, it Lors, 1960, Loresing Limbs, some of which emphasizes its connections with the ancestral African past. In Madagascar, Jacques Ray Maharia wrote verse collected in such volumes as Sur las Marches du Soleil in 1942, On the Edges of the Evening, and plays including Les Dex Magas, 1947, the Malzage gods that were part of the Negritude movement, Bernard Binlin Date of Cote Avarti wrote the autobiographical Clamé, 1956, English translation Clamé, a novel dealing with traditional African society and modern world, as well as drama and lyrical poems. Philly Sabo Seziko of Mali emphasized African tradition in such works as Harisha's Poems du Terroir, African 1955, Harshma's Poems of the African Land, and Poems de Afrique Nord, 1963, Poems from Black Africa. Lamed of Sigo wrote Nareshe poetry, as did the Selgos Lame, Niches Nejerete. In 1968, David Dijap of Sego was a poet in protest of his coups de Pelen, 1956, Hammer Blows, and the Consues poet Antime Roger Bolibiba wrote Es Canzo Cants pour Mon Pez, 1955, and Zago, Songs of My Country, a collection of Negrette poetry. En Cote de Ivari, Anomia Kane wrote love poetry, Les Flax de Come, 1951, The Waters of Come, as did Maurice Con, La Guerliente des Reves, 1961, A Garden of the Words. From Belen came such poets as Richard G. Dogban David and Paulin and Joe Kemin. In Cameroon, Ella Peque Epenya Udo wrote Cameroon, like Cameroon, 1960, Cameroon. Francis Seguet co-wrote Collier de Corvus, 1970, which is Necklace of Courier Shells, and Jean Paul Nuri wrote La Nuit de ma vie, which is Darkness of My Life. In Guinea, prominent poets of the 20th century include Kita Forba, Mayadou, Terva, Ray Arata, Condé, Neshe Kamara. Other poets of the period include William J.F. Syed of Somalia and Tuzet Verrote Menza of Tongo. The novelist and poet Pierre Bonnet is among the Central African Republic's most important writers of the 20th century. The Congo's writer Teje Utams published poetry dealing with colonialism, like the belly. Seydou Dezembo of Mali wrote a novel, Les Unitals, 1960, The Useless Ones, urging African intellectuals to return to their traditional homes. Dennis Ozoya Koto published a novel in 1965 that also dealt with the strains between African tradition and urban life. And Denian Kamarale wrote an autobiographical novel, El Inventor, in 1953, African Child. His most important publication of the novel, La Reine du Roi, 1954, The Renaissance of the King, and the story of Clarence, a white man who, as he moves deeper and deeper into the African forest, is progressively shown of his Western ways and pride. At his end door, he begins anew. When naked and alone, he embraces ambiguous African king, Mongo Bete, a pseudonym for Alexei Baridi Awa of Cameroon, wrote Le Pravag Christ de Bomba, 1956, The Poor Christ of Bomba, a story that deals with complex relationship between Christianity and colonialism in Africa. His mission, Termine, 1956, a Finnish mission, English transition. His mission to Kala treats the uneasy fit of traditional Africa with Western colonialism. Le Royer, Mercole, 1958, English transition, King Lazaret, depicts a generational struggle among the context and the Cuisette view of African tradition. Another novelist from Cameroon, Benjamin Matip, wrote Afrique. Nora's done 1956, Africa, We Don't Pay Attention to You, which shows young men and young people caught between a white man's world and traditional African world. Fernand Lepoid Onyo, also Cameroon's novelist, wrote Une Vie de Boy, 1956, A Life of Boy, English translation, Houseboy, a story of a boy, Tondri, who leaves a rural home and goes into town of Duran, where he becomes a servant for a French commitment, and his wife, Toloni, undergoes a type of puberty rite passage as his experiences among whites slowly reveal him to the mask that he covers in the religion, their justice system, and their family ideals. Onya also wrote Les Vex Neige et la Medali, 1956, The Old Man in the Meadow, Chemin de Europe, 1960, The Road to Europe, novels of Francis Bebé, Les Fels Agatha Molido is Agatha Molido's son, La Poulette Ashanti, 1973, The Ashanti Doll, and Le Roy Albert de Effendi is King Albert, and show the influence of African oral tradition in their style and themes. In the earliest of the novels, a man falls in love, but society clings to a tradition that will not allow him to marry the woman of his choice. Usame Zambine was the first major film director and a significant novelist. Les Bouts, Day Boys, Day You, 1960, God's Bits of Wood. His greatest novel describes the latest grasp of colonialism through the story of the railroad strike. In it, Bayou is the spokesperson for the future that will combine African humanism and African technology. The characters Faakita, Pindam, and Ramalik are all committed to change. Each one is involved in the strike, and each one is also demonstrates dignity and eloquence. La Kita retains its nobility in the face of torture, Pindam in the face of ostracism, and Ramika is the face of enormous want and deprivation. Through it all stands Beiko, who single-mindedly pursues change, although he understands that change cannot be abrupt and must be anchored in the past. Hence his concern for tradition, of which the novel's women are symbols. Seydou Maiton Coyote Mali wrote a play about Zulu leader Shaka, La Mort de Chaka, 1962, The Death of Shaka. K. Loba Kote Avarti wrote Komoida Luenid Noi, 1960, Konibo, and The Black Student, which treats negative efforts of France on traditional African values. His Les Belles Predas, 1970, The Sons of Huta, and the study of the effects of industrialization on traditional societies. Oblique by Khalima Benin wrote the novel Unpeg Sanfin, 1960, Snares Without End, which focuses on African traditional past. The Senegalese writer Shika Hamadou Kane wrote El Aventura Ambigu, 1961, Ambiguous Adventure, a novel that considers African Muslim identity and the main character, Samba, within the context of the Western philosophical thought. In his novel, Le Soleil Noir Point, 1962, The Sun in the Black Dot, Charles Nokon of Coit d'Ivoire deals with efforts to bring nation to freedom. In African post-interdependence periods, similar to the themes presented, were re-justified to conjoin the worlds of which new societies were being forged. Many French language novels in the last decades of the 20th century deal with familiar struggles within traditional society that could never again be the same. Monamina Boyd of Senko wrote Un Cry du Sayor, 1986, A Cry from the Heart, a novel dealing with a woman living in an indifferent male society. Josephine Amadi of Coit d'Ivoire, the author of Koi Koi, Ma Mir, 1993, and Kazukoi, My Mother, a novel about a woman whose existence narrows the death of her male partner. Marie Therese Zega Anaha of Cameroon wrote the novel Societies Africanas at High Society, 1978, African Societies in High Society, a story about two people returning to their country after colonialism, only find a new kind of colonialism, an international kind. Mary Gazelle, aka Kwedi Alves, wrote Les Halons de Lamar, 1994, The Remnants of Love, a novel having to do with the girl's difficulties with her father. Novel written in 1990 by Pyramid Glass. Cameroon deals with the plight of the mother of 11 children who has a harsh husband, poverty, and upper classes preoccupy Matthias. So fall of the single of the Jupiter Day Party, 1993. The Patronage Jubilee, the garbage writer Justine Minsa writes a tragic life of contemporary African village on a novel published in 2000. The relationship between Africa and Europe remained a theme through the end of the 20th centuries. Aji, Oscar Ho, and Sanji writer Indar La Tuese, Otto Corja, 1986, Dark While the Native Tourist, depicts a character returning to Europe and finds things the same in Dakar. In 1999 novel, Cameroonian novelist Nathan Toki tells the story of African who is still a legal immigrant in Paris, a young African woman in Paris. The focus is Giselle Hoyton's Un Farnelli dans la Neige, 1986, Lemongrass in the Snow. Henry Lopes is a Congolese novelist as Mogoe Kambala, who wrote La Dette Coloniale, 1995, The Colonial Debt, depicting Africa and Europe as seen through the eyes of a young African student. We also have Portuguese. The literature of Portuguese and Cape Verde focuses on affinities and strains between Portugal and Cape Verde. Escapism is a theme in some of the poetry and the classical phase of Cape Verdean literature from the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th poetry, such as Jose Lopes and De Salva, 1952, Homesickness, emphasizing Europe. Juanerio Lete and Mario Pinta with poetic essays, wrote national poetry, either poets from Pedro Monarillo, who published Jardin das Harpes in 1926, and Ido Votraz was among the first Cape Verdean writers to publish Credo, a Portuguese Creole language used in the islands. Antônio Pedro wrote a book of exotic poems published in 1929. These early classical poets struggle with the tension between Europe and Africa and between Portuguese language and Creole. The Portuguese Creole was used in the islands, and Brazil also became critical theme. 1936, there was literary revolution when Crawdaddy, Clarity, and Literary Review had appeared. It was published 9 times between 1936 and 1960 and had a considerable influence. A number of so-called Clardial poets emerged, deepening the tension between Africa and Europe. George Barbos was among the founders of Clarendon, and one of them, his first collection of poetry published in 1935, was neologistic and romantic and placed emphasis on everyday person. Basil Lopes, pseudonym Oswald Allen Quintana, wrote Suffering of Cape Verdeans. In his Chico, 1947, was a Portuguese language novel, and it fell precisely into the same pattern of works composed elsewhere in Africa, such as Pita Nagawa's Ingabo, language Omiko, 1935, Samuel Yoshan Natura's Naya novel Nintendo, 1933, Stephen Andrea Empsad Bimba story Kezran Ingala Ozavia, 1950, and the typical heroic fashion. Ibijli's home is his birth journeys and Brazilian city of Sao Vente, where he is educated and returns to his home. While Lopes follows traditional movement, oral tradition, he does with grim realism. When Shoza goes to San Vicente, his experience is anything but glorious, and he's out of work and alienated from his surroundings, and his return home is not of improvement. Here he finds poverty and suffering, and Lopes plays the form of the story here. The dynamic part of Shikudo's home is romanticized, where dramatic contrast with the second part of the story, San Vicente, and the experience of loneliness, sadness. By using irony and device, Lopes brings the two worlds into metaphoric union. The world of Shimi's past is actually revealed in the world of San Vicente, and the third part of the novel, when he returns to the world, is his childhood, because discovers it's no different in the alien world from which he has departed. So it is the child has come of age and moved through puberty, rite of passage, in the fantasy world of his childhood, become jarred into the reality and experiences of San Vicente. Realism and fantasy thus in the union of a story, the fantasy world of childhood just opposed of the real world of adulthood, and the two are experienced now as the same. Materials from the oral tradition are the stuff of Lopes' literary storytelling. He makes critical alterations as he moves from romance to the table of realism in the novel. Another Clardet poem is Manuel Lopes, who is among the journal's founders. He was a novelist and short story writer as well. His poetry substituted with a personal lyricism and with the social themes which reflect concern with the problems and cultural values of Cape Verde. His novel, Chula Brada, 1956, Wild Rain, addresses some of the same themes. Cape Verdean folklore is woven into the short stories, including O Gala K Canto Non by 1959, the literary magazine Presence, founded in 1927, was revolutionary Portuguese publication, urging the break of Portuguese past and encouraging ties with Cape Verde. Carte led to 1944 with the founding of the new review, Certica Certainty, with the same new generation of poets, including Antonio Argolillo Gonzalez and Alcalido Francesco and Antonio Nunes, Sergio Brasanti, and De Jonga, who refused Cape Verdean literature with a new, youthful spirit and retained and continued the emphasis on life in the islands. This generation also represented a new political voice demanding change and reform. Sam Tome Principle also produced writing in Portuguese during the first half of the 20th century. Santos de Costa Alegre wrote poetry, published posthumously in Burgos in 1916, and deals with the tension between Africa and Portugal. Jonas Maria de Fonseca and Fana de Amelia Mia Cocan, Cantos Africanos, 1937, Molly Picon, African Stories, centers on racial prejudice and self-awareness. Francisco Jose Tranillo, influenced by Ami Caesarea, was early negritude poet, and his poetry appeared in Ilha de Home Santo, 1942, Island of the Holy Name. African literature and Portuguese Anglia is origins of the book of poetry written by Jose de Salva Maya Vieira Escavales de Minha Ala, 1849, My Soul, Spontaneous Outpouring, but most significantly, the early feature of Jaquez Diaz Corda Mata, whose book of poetry, Delirious Delirium, was published in 1886. A number of newspapers and journalists provided possibilities for authors to publish their work in the early years, but not cultivated practice. A novel was serialized in 1929, Antonio de Azes Jr.'s Segra de Morta, The Dead Girl's Secret, and a story of racial conflict and alteration. Oscar Rebus wrote novels and poetry. His novel, Unga Feta, The Evil Spell, incorporates local or tradition. The poetry and the prose of Gerald Beza Victor revealed the struggle of the writers caught between Portuguese and African traditions. And Fernando Moredo de Castro Somejo wrote novels including Terra Morta, 1949, Dying Land, Advertium, 1957, The Turn, and depict the impact of colonialism on the Angolan people. Born in Portugal, the poet Tosma Varela Cruz both struggled with and embraced a sense of exile during the decades he spent in Angola. The Movimento de Jovens Intelectuais, movement of the young intellectuals in 1947 to 48, emphasized Angolan traditions and folklore, including the writers Anglos Nito, Maria Pinto, and De Andre and Virgilio La Cruz. Thank you so much. I'm going to see you next week, and we're going to do this all over again with another part of historical literature. Thank you so much. Bye now.